We'll talk about Esther chapter 9, the conclusion to the book of Esther. Now, I will point out that there are difficult chapters in the Old Testament, some chapters that are hard to stomach, and this might be one of them because we see in this story how the tables get turned. The whole point of the book of Esther is how the Jews got saved by the help of a king when they were living in a foreign land. And Esther, this faithful woman who courageously puts herself forward to save her people with the help of her uncle Mordecai. And the point of the story is to say, these faithful Jewish people, they needed to be protected in their religion. Their ethnicity needed to be protected. And the story points out that when you make friends with mammon or with people in positions of power and authority and treat them well, they can give you temporal blessings. And of course, this is what happens. And yet, the story takes kind of a dark turn. In the story in chapter 9, instead of the Jews being executed for being different or being themselves or for worshiping God, they now get empowered by the king to execute all their enemies. And I love how the Book of Mormon plays on this same type of story. If you turn to 3 Nephi chapter 1, you have Nephi, the prophet, preaching to the people that Jesus will come. He's also reminding people of Samuel the Lamanite's prophecies of a particular date when Jesus will be born. When Jesus will be born, and there'll be a night where there's no darkness. The enemies of the Christians in the Book of Mormon times wanted to execute everybody who believed this. And the day this was supposed to happen, the night before, is when Jesus actually shows up. And we have all this light returning to the world, and all these Christians are saved at the last minute. So in that sense, it's a little bit like the book of Esther, where you have a group of people who don't like God's people and are willing to kill them. And in each instance, the people are saved. Now the difference is, in the book of Esther, the Jews end up doing to all their enemies what the enemies wanted done to them, almost like it was like inverse justice. Yet in 3 Nephi chapter 1, we don't find that Nephi and the disciples of Jesus or any of the other people who are calling themselves Christians went and actually executed the people who wanted to kill them. Instead, they teach them the truth. Instead, they spend the time diligently and patiently for many, many months helping people to understand the reality of Jesus coming. And you find out at the end of that 1 year that many of the people who wanted to execute destruction against the Christians in the Book of Mormon were convinced of their error. They acknowledged their error and said, we were wrong, and they've converted to God. We don't find that in the book of Esther. Instead, we find base human nature, where people who felt threatened turn around and threaten other people. It is one way to protect yourself. You kill somebody from killing you, then they can't kill you. But that's not God's way. So this is an interesting way for the story to end. So the book of Esther has been very compelling for readers over many years, but people do find themselves a little disturbed at the actions of these Jews who were under threat and how they treated others. It's interesting that if we consider some later Jewish groups and the kind of biblical records they cared about, for example, the community that created the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't really have the book of Esther. They might have had one very limited number of copies. And it may be because they found this to be troubling. Now, just out of curiosity, of interest, the inspired Bible writers who composed and preserved the story for us may have been sharing the story within a culture that was still familiar with pagan gods. And let me just point out a couple of things. The word Esther seems to be a derivation from the goddess Ishtar. And the character Mordecai seems to be based or modeled on the god Marduk from the Babylonian pantheon. Ishtar was a symbol of royalty, war, and healing, and Marduk was a symbol of justice, compassion, healing, and fairness. And that's kind of primarily what these two Jewish characters are doing. They're seeking to find compassion and justice and fairness in a very unfair world where their people are being put under threat. And I would like to at least end there on a high note, that we live in a world of incredible unfairness. And yet, what does God teach us through Joseph Smith? All the unfairness, all the suffering, All these things are to teach us and to give us experience. All of our suffering will be, in the grand scheme of eternity, but a small moment. And even for these ancient Jews who suffered for a small moment, those that were faithful and persistent and were patient, they found themselves relieved and released by God. Similarly, 3 Nephi chapter 1, those people who held on faithful were ultimately preserved by God. And that is the promise that God offers us, that he will ultimately land us in his celestial kingdom if we persist in being faithful to him and treating him and all his children as he's asked us to do.